Welsh Government documentation contained on the Curriculum for Wales area within Hub. I would highly recommend using this official documentation as a starting point for designing your curriculum and keeping the site to hand as we begin to discuss progression. Curriculum for Wales defines progression in a number of manners. For example, in terms of increasing learner effectiveness. Schools will no doubt have considered learner effectiveness at a whole school level. The Hub site provides guidance into applying these considerations at AOLE level, so I recommend visiting the Science and Technology pages for further information. Another consideration for progression is in the widening and deepening of domain-specific knowledge and skills, both conceptually and contextually. However, any discussion over the canon of knowledge to include soon brings us to questions like what knowledge, what skills, and when do I introduce this new knowledge? So an emerging question becomes, what sources of information exist to help us define this body of knowledge and skills? Official guidance contains details of the mandatory elements contained within the statements of what matters, alongside additional guidance within the descriptions of learning. However, this guidance is just that, guidance, and schools are required to interrogate these statements as they build the curriculum. Questions could still be raised about the what and the when of specific domain knowledge. In that case, how do we begin to make sense of the mandatory and guidance elements? What we need to do is to begin to define a logical sequencing of the interrelated knowledge and skills, and in some manner ensure that the domain knowledge is in a cognitively sensible order. Further, we need to ensure that the new learning is introduced at a developmentally appropriate place in the learner's entire 3 to 16 journey. And as a result, we begin to define the prior and future learning at any point. This kind of planning exists and is often called a progression map. These progression maps expand upon the statements of what matters by exploring the knowledge and skills in the statutory guidance. They provide a locally sourced, cognitively appropriate ordering to the domain-specific knowledge and skills. Here, you can see the statement of what matters, the world around us, and the associated descriptions of learning and progression steps. I have identified what I think is a logical grouping of the descriptions of learning from progression step 1 to progression step 5. All have a common theme that I am identifying as ecosystems. The descriptions of learning can be grouped in this cognitively ascending order in many different ways, and the precise nature of this grouping is at the discretion of schools and clusters. To ensure common language across the CSC region, we are calling this cognitively appropriate grouping of these descriptions of learning a strand. So in my case, the strand is ecosystems. So let's pull out progression steps 1 to 3. Here, I've rewritten the previous representation to allow me space to consider exactly what knowledge and skills underpins each progression step and description of learning. I've also provided myself with space to consider the experiences and vocabulary linked to each progression step. I may be completing this strand alone as a class teacher or subject leader. However, a powerful consideration is to collaborate across a cluster of schools to ensure that all learners in a cluster are working towards cognitively similar sets of knowledge and skills. It is important to point out, though, that the completion of the progression map and strand doesn't in any way constrain your local curriculum. This document is about defining a cognitively consistent set of knowledge and skills, not about how to construct your learning experiences. However, this still prompts the question of, where do I get the information on how to unpack the knowledge and skills? Well, there are a number of obvious sources of this information. There's the old national curriculum, which loosely defines scientific knowledge. However, you'll find that this doesn't provide the necessary detail and doesn't map exactly to the new statements of what matters. GCSE and A-level specifications will be redefined for first teaching from 2025, so care is needed with those documents. Your existing schemes of learning and programmes of study will provide some detail, but again be mindful of the fact that they were written to discharge statutory requirements and exam specifications that may well have changed with Curriculum for Wales. Likewise, commercial schemes of work, however familiar and well resourced, are likely to have been created to meet external criteria that may not align to Curriculum for Wales. In a similar vein, don't underestimate the wealth of knowledge that exists in published material. The canon of knowledge for science and technology is well documented, and it's always useful to explore what others have written on the subject. However, one source of insight must always be considered: your own professional knowledge, skills and experiences. Magnify this by teachers working across a cluster, and you will find that you are well on your way to unpacking the domain knowledge and skills. So here we go. I've begun to add details for knowledge, skills and experiences from progression step 1 to 3. There is cognitive order. For example, before introducing the concept of an ecosystem at progression step 2, learners will begin to explore that different animals require different foodstuffs and choose to live in different places. And I can see at a glance the prior and future learning. Such a document will allow me to move up and down the cognitive order to tailor my teaching to the learners in front of me. So, to summarise, a progression map defines an agreed body of knowledge in a logical cognitive order. At a glance, you can see future and prior learning, and there's space to unpack knowledge, skills, experiences and vocabulary. But as stated previously, it does not define or constrain your curriculum. So in that case, how do you use a progression map? Well, progression maps inform the curriculum building process. As stated, they give you the developmentally appropriate cognitive order to the knowledge and skills that you will select as you define your curriculum. The 4 purposes: local and cluster context, learner voice, cross-curricular frameworks and mandatory responsibilities provide the why and the how, and your progression maps will help you to begin to define the what.